The official histories, the untold and the secret history of the Mongols, speak of steel, strategy, and the divine mandate of the eternal blue sky. They chronicle the unification of the steppe, the Yasa law code, and the unstoppable sweep of the Pax Mongolica. They are records of administration, of movement, of destiny. They are monuments to the architect. They do not speak of the mortar. To understand the darkest secret of Genghis Khan's empire, one must first reject the popular image of chaotic, rampaging hordes. The Mongol war machine was a system of unparalleled cold precision. Its efficiency was its defining characteristic, and like any efficient system, it required fuel, not just horses and arrows, but human fuel. This was not slavery as the ancient world understood it, a system of domestic service or agricultural labor. This was something new, something born of the steppe's unique sociology and the Khan's transcendent ambition. It was a system of human resource management so total, so institutional, that its victims became statistical units, their identities erased long before their lives were spent. The institution was the Keshig, the imperial guard, and the broader military administrative apparatus it served. The victim group was not a single people, but a perpetual rotating population, prisoners of war from every conquered territory, the Tanguts, the Jin, the Khwarizmians, the Rus. The method was not mere bondage, but a process of systematic atomization and functional repurposing. A captive became a number. A number was assigned a function. The function was the entirety of their being. The process began at the moment of surrender. After a city fell, the standard procedure was the division. Artisans, scribes, and those with useful skills were separated, catalogued, and dispersed to serve the empire's infrastructure. Young women and children were often assimilated. The remaining adult males, soldiers, citizens, the able-bodied, underwent a different classification. They were not seen as a cohesive group to be feared, but as raw material to be utilized. This was the first shock to outsiders, the lack of malice, the absence of vengeful ceremony. It was a colder, more clinical process. They were counted, divided into manageable cohorts of 100 and placed under the watch of a Mingan, a commander of 1,000, whose loyalty to the Khan was absolute. These cohorts were not sent to mines or plantations. The Mongol economy was not built on static labor. They were integrated into the machine itself. They became the Aljinchi, the vanguard. In the next military engagement, they would be placed at the very front of the formation, equipped with minimal arms, often just the weapons of their fallen countrymen. Their purpose was threefold: to absorb the enemy's first barrage of arrows and charges, to blunt their initial momentum, and to reveal their tactical dispositions. They were living reconnaissance, expendable sensors in the Khan's battlefield calculus. Survivors of one engagement would be marched forward to the next. Their existence was a continuous walking purgatory between battles. Beyond the battlefield, another layer of the system operated. Captives were used as human sappers during sieges, forced to dig trenches, build siegeworks, and fill moats under direct enemy fire. They were human shields, driven ahead of Mongol troops during assaults on city walls. But the most psychologically potent application was as human currency. In the vast, logistical nightmare of moving an army across continents, these captives were a transport asset. They carried loot, supplies, and equipment. When a river needed crossing, they were driven into the water to test its depth and current, or to form a living, struggling bridge for the Mongol cavalry to ride across. The authority was always visible, yet impersonal. A lone Keshig officer on a calm horse, watching the divisions with a ledger. The cold, unblinking gaze of a Noyan commander surveying the human material. There was no need for excessive brutality in daily control. The absolute certainty of collective punishment for any transgression was enough. The steppe itself was the prison. To flee was to face a landscape more hostile than any captor. This was the system in its functional state. It was brutal, but it had a terrible logic. It shocked visiting diplomats and spies not for its sadism, but for its sheer impersonal scale. It treated human life as a logistical commodity. But this operational system had a secret core, a protocol reserved for a specific, recurring scenario that revealed the true depth of the Khan's calculus. It was a protocol so cold, so efficiently cruel, that it was never written in the Yasa. It was communicated only by oral command to the highest Orloks, and its enactment was what truly terrified his own generals. It was the moment when the system shifted from utilizing human fuel to actively consuming it, not for tactical advantage, but for a darker, more abstract purpose: the engineering of terror as a permanent, self-replicating weapon. The operational use of captives was the visible mechanism, the grinding of them. But the true secret, the one that resonated in the hushed jurs of the senior Noyans long after the campaigns, was the protocol for strategic expenditure. This was not battlefield calculus. This was psychological architecture on an imperial scale. It occurred when a conquered population or a newly approached territory exhibited a particular trait: resilient cultural cohesion, a deep-seated religious or monarchical loyalty that could seed future rebellion. The Mongols could crush armies and shatter cities, but they understood that ideas and the collective identity that held them were a harder target. The standard method of taking hostages from the elite was often insufficient. A more profound lesson was required. The protocol was known internally by no dramatic name. It was referred to operationally as the accounting. When a city or region was subdued under circumstances of prolonged resistance or perceived intransigence, a census would be taken, not of wealth but of the male population. A percentage would be selected, not the elderly, not the visibly infirm, but the fathers, the brothers, the craftsmen, the community pillars. The selection was methodical, observed by Mongol scribes. These men were not executed immediately. Instead, they were separated and formed into a new unit, stripped of any remaining identifiers of their former culture. They were then marched, not to the next battlefield, but to a neighboring province, a rival city-state, or a vassal kingdom that was currently compliant. The march was a public spectacle of abject power. The captives were kept alive, fed the bare minimum, and driven forward. Upon arrival at the gates of the compliant city, a place perhaps recently sworn to the Khan, a ceremony would be held. The local rulers and population would be compelled to assemble. The Mongol commander would then formally gift the column of prisoners to the compliant ruler. The gift was not one of labor, it was a gift of execution. The compliant ruler was ordered, under the silent gaze of the Keshig, to put every single one of the gifted captives to death. Publicly, by their own hand, using their own methods. The Mongols would not perform the killings. They would only observe. This was the core of the horror. The act transformed a compliant vassal into a complicit one. By shedding the blood of their neighbors, their cultural cousins, or even their former rivals, they created a river of blood guilt between themselves and the wider region. They could never again pose as unwilling subjects or secret allies of the conquered. They were now marked, bound to the Mongol order by a shared, horrific crime. Their compliance was cemented not by fear of the Mongols alone, but by the mortal fear of revenge from those whose kin they had slaughtered. For the captive column, the psychological torment was exquisite. They were not marched to a heroic death in battle. They were marched to a political slaughter, to be butchered as a diplomatic token by those who had submitted. Their deaths were stripped of all meaning, all honor, transformed into a mere administrative tool. The second layer of the protocol was even more chilling in its systemic coldness. In the vast logistical camps, a separate classification existed: the untouched. These were captives, often the healthiest and strongest, who were deliberately kept isolated, spared from labor or vanguard duty. They received slightly better rations. They were a reserve. When the army prepared for a major river crossing into unknown territory or a long march through a desert, these men were brought forward. They were given water skins and minimal supplies, and they were sent out first, not as scouts but as probes. Their function was to find the safe paths, the potable water sources, and the viable fords by the most direct method possible, their survival or their demise. A column of the untouched disappearing into a canyon was a clearer map than any scout's report. Their perishing in a salt flat marked it as non-viable for the main army. They were living, breathing cartographic instruments, their lives expended to calibrate the empire's route. The secrecy around these practices was maintained not through complex oaths, but through the very structure of the empire. The Yam messenger system, the lifeline of Mongol control, carried administrative decrees and military orders. It did not carry reports on the consumption of human material. This data was recorded in separate ledgers, kept by the Keshig and the personal scribes of the Khan and his top Orloks. These were not chronicles for posterity, they were resource management tables. The numbers of captives taken, divided, expended, and gifted were tracked with the same precision as the counts of horses, arrows, and sacks of grain. The psychological pressure was not just on the victims, but on the perpetrating institution itself. Generals like Subutai or Jeeb, men of immense fortitude, understood battlefield sacrifice. But the cold, premeditated, bureaucratic expenditure of human life for abstract, long-term political engineering, this operated on a different moral plane. It demonstrated a vision of control so absolute, so devoid of the heat of passion, that it implied a mind viewing humanity itself as a landscape to be terraformed. To question it was not to question cruelty, but to question the foundational, impersonal logic of the Khan's power. The terror it instilled in his own commanders was the terror of understanding the full, amoral scope of the machine they served. They saw that in the Khan's calculus, loyalty itself could be manufactured through shared atrocity, and that even they were not beyond being used as components in this grand, terrible design. The aftermath was not marked by monuments or memorials. It was defined by a silence woven into the geography itself. The cities that had been the theater for the accounting did not rebuild grand monuments to their fallen. They rebuilt walls, markets, and administrative offices under the watch of Mongol daraghatches. The compliant rulers who had performed the executions ruled with a brittle authority, forever glancing over their shoulders, their legitimacy now poisoned at the root. The river of blood guilt became an invisible border, a fissure in the regional psyche that the Pax Mongolica's enforced peace could paper over but never heal. The secret was not a hidden truth. It was a missing population, a generation of fathers and brothers whose absence was the true monument. The erasure was systematic. The separate ledgers kept by the Keshig, the cold balance sheets of human expenditure, were the most volatile documents in the empire. They contained the operational truth that contradicted the official history of destiny and divine order. Upon the death of Genghis Khan, and at key successional junctures, it is believed these specific records were purged. Not in a dramatic burning, but through dissolution. The bark and parchment were scraped clean, the data transferred verbally to only the most essential successors, or simply allowed to fade. The secret history speaks in allegory and sanctioned myth. The raw data of the human cost was the true secret, and its safeguarding required its obliteration. The institution protected itself by consuming its own memory. The legacy is not one of ghost stories or vengeful spirits haunting the steppe. The Mongol Empire's legacy is one of breathtaking administrative innovation, transcontinental exchange, and shocking military success. The Dark Protocol's legacy is subtler, more pervasive. It is visible in the profound, centuries-long demographic and cultural fractures it engineered across Central Asia. It is in the deep-seated distrust between neighboring peoples that can be traced to the 13th century, a distrust seeded when one group was forced to annihilate another to prove loyalty to a distant, impersonal power. It echoes in the chillingly modern concept of psychological warfare, of using atrocity not just to punish, but to permanently alter political and social landscapes. The Khan understood that the most effective terror is not random but systemic, not a spasm of violence but a policy. He demonstrated that loyalty could be manufactured through forced complicity, binding subordinates not by reward, but by shared guilt. This became a dark strand in the DNA of imperial control, studied in staff colleges for centuries to come. For the generals who knew, the silence lasted a lifetime. They rode to further conquests, administered vast territories, and were buried with honor. But they carried the knowledge of the mechanism, the understanding that they were instruments of a will that saw human life as a variable in a grand equation of control. Their terror was not of the Khan's anger, but of the sheer, scalable logic he embodied. In their final years, looking out over the empire they helped build, they saw not just cities and trade routes, but the empty spaces where the columns had marched, the silent steps that had absorbed the probes. The empire's greatness was undeniable, but its foundation was, in part, a calculated, institutionalized void. There is no closure to this history. There is only the echo. An echo in the fragmented histories of subjugated peoples, in the gaps in the genealogical records of Central Asia, in the unresolved tensions of regions once spliced together by Mongol decree and severed by Mongol design. The darkest secret of Genghis Khan is not a single act of cruelty, but the revelation of a paradigm, that power in its most absolute form can operate with the temperature of a void, and that the most enduring structures of control are often built on the deliberate, documented creation of absence. The silence that followed was not an accident. It was the intended result. The system worked.